He was the military governor of Alexandria, and Alexandria needed a strong military governor. Rowdy troops roamed the streets, forcing local residents to remain in their homes. It was dangerous to go out. Mrs. Robert Jameson was wounded by a young soldier in a shooting accident, and Mary Butler died of a gunshot wound inflicted by a drunken soldier. A trooper of the 16th New York wrote, "The men who were put into the Alexandria jail tested its capacity." General Slough, the military governor, wrote, "When the present military governor took command here, there was a reign of terror in Alexandria. The streets were crowded with intoxicated soldiers. Murder was almost an hourly occurrence, and disturbances, robbery, and rioting were constant. The sidewalks and docks were covered with drunken men, women, and children, and quiet citizens were afraid to venture out." We next have a picture of Christ Church. During the occupation, many churches were turned into hospitals and stables. Robert E. Lee married George Washington's step-granddaughter, Mary Custis, in this church, and he attended Christ Church when he was in the area. Christ Church's reputation as George Washington's place of worship preserved it as a church, unlike many churches in the area. Union Army chaplains soon conducted services here, where a Union Army congregation grew up. Most of the original parishioners started worshiping with other Southern sympathizers elsewhere. When the war ended, the church was returned to its parishioners with its interior intact. Well, by the summer of 1863, the Alexandria Gazette reported old residents of Alexandria had mostly departed. Not 1/3 of the original inhabitants now remain. Many of the old mansions have been deserted by their owners and are now used as barracks or offices for the military authorities. Union Army Lieutenant Charles Hayden found Alexandria a quaint-looking old place. "There is not a half an hour in the day that I do not have George Washington's presence associated with the surrounding scenery." Lieutenant Hayden mused, "It would do us all good to spend an hour at the grave of Washington in tears over the fate of our country." We next have a picture of Union officers in front of Gadsby's Tavern, which was known at that time as the City Hotel. Benjamin Barton, an Alexandria businessman, wrote, "There is a great change in the population. It is more than double in number. I meet so many strangers in the street that I feel like being in a strange city. Very few of our old inhabitants are to be seen. Many have gone away. Others have nothing to call them from their homes. Many have died, and very few townsmen are in business now." Well, the wisdom of leaving the county became especially clear when men suspected of being Confederate sympathizers were arrested and sent to prison. The citizens of Alexandria were called upon to sign a loyalty oath renouncing the Confederacy. Most residents refused to sign the oath. This made life in the occupied town very difficult. Taking out a business license, being on the street after dark, leaving town, and even buying a cemetery plot required proof that an individual had signed the oath. At one point, those who did not sign the oath were threatened with forcible deportation. Well, between the Union forts on the outskirts of Alexandria and the Confederate forces just beyond, Northern Virginia was rapidly becoming a no-man's land. Both sides sent out scouting and reconnaissance parties, which made clashes inevitable. One Fairfax Unionist declared that Northern families in the countryside had been robbed of nearly everything on earth, so that they are all in absolute want. We next have a picture of the Army Fire Department on Princess Street. In April 1863, the City Fire Department reported that only 2 of the 4 volunteer fire companies were capable of meeting emergencies. 2 engines had been destroyed, and the companies disbanded. Fortunately, 2 steam fire engines operated by the Army Quartermaster Department were housed on Princess Street and responded to fire alarms in the city. Alexandria also became the headquarters of Francis Harrison Pierpont, the governor of the restored state of Virginia, which comprised the several northern Virginia counties occupied by Union troops. He lived at 415 Prince Street. The capital of the restored state was established in Alexandria for the remainder of the Civil War. We next turn to one of the darkest subjects in the history of Alexandria, the slave trade. And here we have a picture of the outside of the infamous slave pen on Duke Street. Alexandria was a major center for the domestic slave trade during the antebellum period. Hundreds of thousands of slaves were shipped to the labor-hungry cotton fields of the Deep South. Most citizens of Alexandria accepted the slave trade as part of the natural order of things. But a small group of citizens, mostly Quakers, resented the presence of the slave trade. These Virginians spoke up against the harshness and misery inflicted by the slave traders, who drove slaves through the streets of the city to confinement in loathsome prisons. The statement of the Benevolent Society of Alexandria for ameliorating and improving the condition of the people of color read as follows: "These enormous cruelties cannot be practiced among us without producing a sensible effect upon the morale of the community, for the temptation to participate in so lucrative a traffic, though stained with human blood, is too great to be withstood by all, and even many of those who do not directly participate in it become so accustomed to its repulsive features that they cease to discourage it in others." Here we have another picture of the front of the slave pen. Slaves being sold to cotton planters further south were brought to Alexandria from the countryside and housed in the slave pen until the time for sale. After sale, they were herded to the Alexandria wharfs and shipped out in lots by steamboat. Lewis Bailey, taken from his family and sold as a young boy, walked back to Alexandria from Texas after the Civil War to be reunited with his mother. Runaway slaves were a major problem for masters in the antebellum period, both economically and psychologically. Masters were forced to explain why so-called contented and well-cared-for servants ran away so frequently and in such large numbers. Many owners concluded that frequent runaways must be mentally imbalanced. Well, masters devoted considerable energy to controlling the movement of slaves. Written passes were needed to leave the plantation. Overseers watched the slave quarters. Slave patrols were formed. Professional slave hunters were employed, and rewards were offered. Here we have a picture of the interior of the slave pen. As you can see, the doors and windows were grated like those of ordinary prisons. At night, the slaves were often chained, lest they should overpower their keepers. Slave trade came to an abrupt end with liberation. And next we have a picture of the slave pen in disarray. Slave trader George Gephardt went out of business very abruptly on May the 24th, 1861, as the Union Army marched into Alexandria. When federal troops arrived at the slave pen on Duke Street, the pen was completely in disarray,